I think that if we think about treating everybody the same, we assume that everybody has the same starting point or the same support, and that's not the case. So there is much more to do.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of 80% Mental, a podcast all about the psychology of sport performance. We've covered quite a lot of ground. If Series 1 was an introduction to the mental side of sports performance, I think Series 2 has definitely gone beneath the surface a little bit more. We've had some absolutely fantastic discussions on topics like critical thinking, on injury, on sport parenting, creating team culture, and I don't know about you, but I've learned loads. Well, we usually start with a question, but to be brutally honest, I couldn't actually think of a good question for this one. So it's more of a statement that we're going to discuss. And that statement is diversity and cultural awareness in sport. It's not really a statement either, really. It's just a sort of title. But that's what we're going to discuss today. And the caliber of guests that we've had so far on this series has been absolutely first class. And we are going to keep that bar high today with two brilliant guests who are going to try and help us to navigate this topic of diversity and cultural awareness. So I'm delighted to introduce our two guests for today. First up, we have Shamima Yusuf. Shams is a transnational intersectional feminist. Shams is a like, you wrote it.
I know it's a math.
Shams is a transnational intersectional feminist sports psychologist. Try saying that 3 times really fast. An ASP certified mental performance consultant and a registered mental health counselor. She has a private practice, Empowered to Perform, and works internationally in culturally diverse environments of Olympic sport, youth performance, and the corporate industry as well. And more than that, I am really proud to have Shams as a good friend who has supported me a lot in the last couple of years. So Shams, welcome to 80% Mental.
Really nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Our second guest is Alessandro Quartiroli. How did I do?
Fantastic.
Wonderful. Originally from Italy, Ale moved to the USA via Spain in 2005. He's an associate professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. And Ale is also an ASP certified mental performance consultant. Ale's main areas of interest focus on professional issues, ethics, training, and practice. And again, I'm delighted to have Ale on the podcast today. So Ale, welcome to 80% Mental.
Thank you. It's my privilege and honor to be here with you all.
Well, I mean, I don't think we could have asked for two better guests to talk about the topic that we are talking about today, which is diversity and cultural awareness in sport. It's a really important topic, but often when words like diversity, inclusion, cultural awareness are mentioned, we're often met with responses like, okay, well, I just treat everybody the same. I don't see difference. Now, on the surface of it, that might seem like a perfectly reasonable position to take. But, you know, I certainly have issues with that position. What do you feel are some of the problems with that approach?
Well, I feel that with that kind of response, it suggests that you don't see the difference, and you fail to see the qualities and the richness of one's culture and identity, and thereby don't really appreciate some of the wonderful lessons that can be gained from people who do have different experiences. I think there's also an element of that you don't see the injustice that has perhaps surrounded me as someone who is of a marginalized identity. And so you sort of default to maybe the status quo, which is, well, I'm not doing any harm, but then what are you doing to actively dismantle some of those barriers that I face and others like me face?
Yeah, I agree with what Shamima mentioned. I think that getting behind the idea I treat everybody the same is there is a whole lot of assumption. And the first assumption is everybody is the same, which is not. We are all different. And as Shemema says, by assuming that we can treat everybody the same, we also forget to celebrate what makes us unique and how we can celebrate each other's uniqueness and learning from it. Now, the two things I'd like to add. One is that it's partially my personal experience, but experience also of some of the people I work with, which is in one specific context, we might be in the position to say, I can't treat everybody the same when I'm in a position of privilege. In another context, that privilege might be taken away. And now, how do I feel about this statement? I think that oftentimes we forget to put ourselves in that position. I was actually listening to Joe Amiachi description of white privilege recently for an N time on Twitter, and I think it's great because he made two distinctions. One is the idea is not being a bad person, and the other is we all have some privilege, and I think that that is an important reminder in terms of talking about treating everybody the same. And last point that I think about it is the difference between equality and equity. I think that if we think about treating everybody the same, we assume that everybody has the same starting point or the same support or the same possibility or the same history and story and journey, and that's not the case. And so there is much more to do.
So on the surface of it, this idea of being blind, I guess, to differences, like I said, it seems like almost a noble position to take in some respects. Well, I don't see the differences in people. I treat everybody the same. But actually, by doing that, you're saying we're missing out on not only the differences that we should be celebrating that we see in other people, but also we're missing some of the disadvantages that they might experience as well because of those differences. So yeah, I think again, coming back to my original point, whereas it seems like a really noble position to take, there are deep flaws with it, and I think acknowledging that is probably the first step towards what we are really talking about today, which is sort of understanding diversity and having a bit more cultural awareness in a field of sport where we work.
When you see someone the same, you're not mindful of your language either in that case. So, I recall being in a workshop some years ago and sitting at the back of the workshop, and the presenter sort of said, right, let's get moving, everyone, stand up. And of course, at the back of the room, there were two students there in wheelchairs. And, really not, if you treat everyone the same, you're not mindful of the language that you're using. So you're using very generalistic language, and so that can be problematic. And so, in effect, what ended up happening is excluding those two individuals at the back of the room. So that's where I think these differences do become important, because we need to think about how are we talking about things, what is our narrative, and what is the context that we're in.
When we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, um, there is this idea of the saviors, right? There's a group of people that is doing that for others to make their journey, whatever, easier, harder, whatever they might be. And I think that at times this perspective is extremely limiting, where I think that we could flip it and think about how can I change my own life to reach this level of equity. And because until I'm a white guy, middle class, highly educated, heterosexual, in an English speaking context, until I talk, I'm as majority as it gets. And until I think about how I can make somebody else's life better, I still keep my privilege. And I wonder instead if the question could be asked, how can I work on myself to make that change and to create more equity? And then the process of supporting the process and using my privilege to change the system is important. And I also think that cannot be the only direction of the work that we do. I hope that it was clear what I was trying to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah, and it comes back to what you mentioned earlier as well. The video that John Amici made about white privilege, but also about just privilege in general. And if you haven't seen that yet, if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't seen that video, I urge you to go and watch it. And we will put a link to it in the description because it is a fantastic explainer of privilege. And I think, Ale, you sort of alluded to this a little bit in your previous answer, but you know, when we talk about cultural competence, what do we mean by that? And I don't know if either of you want to go first with this one, but what is cultural competence?
On one aspect is I feel that there is always this idea of competence as these things that we get it and we reach, and when we're done, we're good. Competence in general, I don't believe that's the case. Cultural competence even less. Academically, competence have been described as knowledge, awareness, and skills. Um, I was thinking of a project that I recently carried on and talking to people who define their work as culturally competent and culturally grounded. And some of the things that were brought up that made me reflect was one aspect is cultural competence is an ethical obligation, something that is not should we do it, maybe do it. It's something that has to be so much part of what we do and integrated what we do. I think that generally speaking, cultural competence has this idea of trying to understand how the peculiarities that the other person carry on in our working relationship and our relationships in general, and their background and their uniqueness, as long as with mine, can be part of what we do throughout the relationship we develop. And and I think that part of that can be developed formally with formal training, and not necessarily just with formal training. I think that we miss opportunities to develop those competence, if you want to call them that way,
Mm-hmm.
that has to do with the relationship that we all have, exactly for what discussed earlier about how we all have a set of uniqueness. And I think that that's a work that we cannot expect to be able to do um, in our job exclusively. Only when we are on the job is a work that we have to continue to do it.
Yeah, I think you've spoken to this idea that we don't become reductionist. So just because we see individuals from the outset, we may think of them as belonging to a certain group. It's important that we have some universal idea of the cultural belonging and some knowledge that will help us, some knowledge and skills that will help us with understanding that cultural group. But that's from a universal perspective. But then we also really need to understand their uniqueness, and this is what Ali is speaking to. We then have to embed that knowledge into the techniques and the strategies that we as practitioners implement with our clients. We have to understand how those issues of diversity can impact the interpersonal relationship with the client. So also recognizing that how are we turning up to that experience with the client? What are we carrying? So if we are coming in with privilege, are we aware of that privilege? But at the same time, I could be a person who has been marginalized in numerous ways. And how am I turning up to that relationship having been marginalized by a group that perhaps my client is now in front of me representing? And so that can impact the relationship that we have. So it's being aware of that, it's being willing to self-reflect. So that cultural self-reflection is so important, that how do we identify what aspects of our identity are important to us.
Mm-hmm.
So that those just some thoughts that come to my mind, and in terms of how we go about developing that ongoing competence.
Mhm.
Again, as Ali says, it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, so that ongoing nature of it, that critical self-reflection, the understanding of one's own position of privilege, and where that situates you in the relationships that you have with coaches, with athletes, between coaches and athletes.
Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting is, and we haven't really mentioned this, but I'm going to, is that when we talk about cultural competence and understanding, because Shams, you just mentioned kind of understanding your own culture and your own sort of position, we don't really talk about whiteness in that respect. We kind of assume that we're talking about otherness when we talk about cultural competence, but actually, exploring where somebody might sit as a white person, even in a predominantly Western white country, is also an important position to examine in terms of, uh, you know, how you might interact and how you might come across and how you might work with the people that you work with.
Absolutely, I think it's examining that whiteness. Of course, I don't identify as a white person, um, and sorry, oh gosh. So for me, it's more about what privileges do I have that I'm showing up with,
Mhm.
actually, I fell short on this one in my practice. I felt short on this one, whereby I was working with an athlete, and not recognizing that, I guess you would define me as educated. I've been well educated, and my language, the use was not relating to the athlete. The athlete turned around and said to me, "Can you use, words that I can understand, please?"
Mhm.
So again, it's really reflecting on that privilege that we show up with. And so, whilst you talk about whiteness, I'm talking about now socioeconomic status
Mhm.
that has enabled me to gain an education that perhaps my athlete hasn't had. And so, how am I presenting and interacting with that athlete in a way that is one culturally aware, but relates to the athlete?
So I think what I'm picking up from this is privilege isn't something that we should be afraid of or shy away from or get defensive about, because there are numerous layers of privilege. You've talked about, we've talked about color, we've talked about socioeconomic status, we've talked about education, and we are all privileged in some way or another. And again, what I'm hearing is this idea of acceptance of that is the first step to becoming a little bit more competent in this area. Okay, so we've talked about this idea of cultural competence, all right, and we've talked about this idea of awareness being a really important step and not being defensive when we talk about things like privilege. Um, okay, so I'm a young coach, right, or a young psych, or even a really old one. I'm fully on board. I can see the gaps in my training. I can see the need for some development. Like, where do I start? Like, what can I do as a psychologist or a coach, like I say, to become more culturally competent, to become more aware? Well, like, what can I actually do?
Self-reflect. I mean, we've spoken just a little bit about this already. Is that, start with yourself. Start with, how do you identify, and what are the power and privileges that come through your cultural identity you have. And recognizing that, though we can go through all this cultural self-reflection, we also want to practice that um, cultural humility, because whilst we're aware of the power and the privileges that we have, and then, and we start to learn about other cultures, we're not the expert on everyone else's culture.
Hmm.
So as a practitioner, I mean, for me, I mean, I when I show up to a session, um, I may very well start with recognizing some of the difference there between me and my athlete, or the person in front of me, and
Mhm.
really try to explore what's important to them, because they are the experts. I'm not the expert. They are the ones they are the expert of how they identify in their culture. So it's about learning from others in a way that's not, so where, offensive,
Mhm.
by sort of, questioning, or where are you from, as if to point out that you don't belong, but in a way that really is interested in the person that is sitting in front of you.
It's a really interesting one that you talked about asking not in a way to highlight that the person doesn't belong, and it's just where are you from? Well, I'm from Gateshead. Okay, well, where are you really from?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, no, just because I'm black, I'm still from Gateshead, right? So I
Yeah,
know
yeah.
you're expecting me to say like some sort of exotic, African location, but actually I'm from Gateshead. But even just asking that simple question in a way that is, you know, you see it as a harmless question that you're generally interested in somebody's background, but actually what you're doing is you're highlighting that they don't necessarily belong in the same way that you do. So I just thought it was a really interesting example that you mentioned there. Ale, your background, we talked earlier, your kind of area of expertise is in training and ethics. And, I wonder from your perspective in terms of, young psychologists, even young coaches, young athletes, even, what can they do? What steps can they take to develop this awareness or to become more competent, if we want to use that word?
Being deliberate and making our own personal choice
Hmm.
and wanted to be culturally competent, and not just because it's a course or it's a competence that I have to do it because the requirements or whatever accreditation I'm doing it. I also believe that there is some aspect of self exploration, and I would encourage, I identify as a white person. The average white person assume that everybody else has a race or a culture but themselves,
Hmm.
and that's not the case. And so when we get in a relationship, the average white person is always about, tell me about your whatever. And my question is, have you asked yourself the same question?
Mm,
And so
Hmm.
I think that this is a very important aspect of become cultural competent. I guess it was I was trying to mention earlier. This idea is always about the other, and I think that you get to a point where it's about yourself as well. Um, you know, I'm in, with my partner. We have been together for over 10 years, and we come from very ethnical, racial, cultural backgrounds, and uh, and it's always very interesting. And we live in a third cultural background, and it's very interesting the negotiation behind it. And oftentimes, I always ask myself, okay, how does this plays a role in that relation? And generally, you see only when you talk outside. I'm Italian, so people say, "Oh, Italy, that's great," and then, but they cannot understand me. My partner is from Iran,
Hmm.
and so they completely dismiss Iran. But my partner
Hmm.
is English, is like a native level, and you can probably figure out I'm as far as you can possibly imagine to be a native English speaker. And it's always an interesting dynamic to see. So having that self exploration is, I think, that is the background for the self reflection itself. Uh, I also think two other pieces, there is a little bit of movement right now in the field, and provide some training. ASP is doing, Basis is doing, ISSP is providing. So these are a great aspect. Programs are creating courses about cultural competence. One
Hmm.
piece that I personally feel and think that is missing is that we continue to see culture as this external piece that when we learn. It's like a new technique, right? You have it, but you choose to use it or not, depending. And I think that until we don't make the shift of making culture as a center part of everything we study, we develop, we train, and we apply, we are not even close to get there
Hmm.
because culture is who we are, and all identities are who we are. And so this exploration of myself, exploration of the client, exploration of how this identity fit, and how this goes beyond anything we do, and therefore it has to be integrated in everything we do. I think that is part that we still have to work. So as a young coach, I would say two things, or young psychologist, two things. One is do this personal journey to engage it, and the other is getting some training. But most importantly, is to not leave that as a checkbox in a list.
Mhm.
Often cultural perspectives is siloed. Cultural diversity is siloed in organizations, in training. It's always a piece on its own. And when we're studying about sports psychology in training programs, we're always learning through a Western lens. And never ever do we discuss how that sits culturally and through, and I was having a conversation actually with a colleague of mine, a Chinese Hong Kong based colleague this week, funny enough, and to gain her perspective. And she said, I guess it would have been great, because she was in my class at university, and she said, I guess it would have been great if we could have been able to discuss from different cultural perspectives what some of those theories, how some of those theories would be integrated within their cultural domain, if you like, in their context. Because of course, with Chinese culture, it's a more of a collective culture. And often I would sit with her in class and sort of say, you don't say very much, you don't speak up very much, and that'd be later on when she and I would have a natter, and she sort of said to me, well, to speak up and question, the professor is to show disrespect, right?
Mm.
In their culture, and it reminds me of the African culture too. I come from a part of Africa which is influenced by the Zulu culture, and everyone is more and more people have heard of Ubuntu, or if you're Zimbabwean, you would say Hunu, which is related. And with the African culture, you come into being, you're seen through another human being. So in a lot of cases, it's your elders that bring you into being,
Mm.
right? That respect piece. And so what I'm trying to say is that when we're learning sports psychology, and we're learning about the self, and we're learning about challenge, and speaking up and questioning, if you're a coach, or you're a practitioner, and you've got athletes in that environment, um, and you're challenging them to speak up, we're not learning about this in our sports psychology classes. Well, what about if you've got different cultures? How are you
Mm.
working with them uh, to 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 really recognize that they may not speak up because of their cultural belonging?
I mean, I saw one of your tweets the other week, Shams, about looking back at theories in sports psychology and sort of almost relearning theories.
Mm.
And you were saying that a lot of them are derived through Western lenses, or are kind of based on Western ideals. Motivation is one that springs to mind for me. We all learn about self-determination theory, extrinsic, intrinsic motivation, how they relate to performance. And we kind of just accept that and think, okay, well, that's how motivation works. But as you say, we're kind of missing something there, aren't we?
I think we are. I mean, I've actually written about this, or spoken to this, in I think a chapter I wrote with Angel Brutus. Actually, was we have a lot of international students, athletes, who come across from different parts of the world, Eastern cultures, African cultures, and a lot of them go over to the US, to the UK, and engage in sport in those systems. And a lot of the time, they're not motivated by self, right? They're motivated by the whole community at home, is with them on that journey, not necessarily physically,
Hmm.
but in spirit, in unity, in community. And so often they're motivated by that collective identity, is that I'm doing this for my whole community, and also motivated by the opportunities. They don't have necessarily the same sort of access to those sort of facilities that they may that they don't have in their home countries, perhaps. And so, of course, they go to systems like the American systems or British systems that may provide them with a lot of those facilities. But I think we need to examine that a little bit more and not just think about it in terms of self-determination theory or,
Mm.
intrinsic and extrinsic motivation.
So, Ale, in my quest then as a young coach or a young psych to be more aware of, delivering culturally informed sports psychology or coaching, what are some of the things that I might be wary of here? So I can be really enthusiastic. Yeah, I'm going to take on board this challenge. I'm going to learn. I'm going to become more aware. What are the pitfalls or potential pitfalls?
I, I'm thinking. Sorry for the quiet time. I guess that one of the things I will feel comfortable in saying, listening more than talking, and so that can be a pitfall and a strategy, right?
Mm.
In the sense that sometimes we get so fixated in what we think is the right way to work that we just start to work versus having done all the work that we have just described right now.
Mm.
And so I think that is an important piece. I think that being intentional in expect or talking about pitfall, expecting the aspect like culture or identities that just come up. It may or may not be the correct assumption, right? And so I think that being more intentional and helping people to create that space where recognizing who we are in this space together is important. So, and as I mentioned already, I identify as a white person. If a person who identifies as a black individual come in my office pretending that is not there and just working, I think we tell this person that I value for half of who you are, or I value myself for half of who I am.
Mm.
Instead, acknowledging and say, hey, okay, let's talk a little bit about this relationship. We talked earlier about white privilege. And one thing I found helpful to me is acknowledging, immediately acknowledge when I work with people. And that goes from client to students.
Mm.
I acknowledge that I have privilege, I acknowledge that I'm in a position of power in some situation, and make that acknowledgement says, I cannot avoid it. I'll do my best to work through it with you. I think that sometimes this acknowledgement helps to create a space where the relationship can be a little bit more effective. A pitfall that can happen in terms of culture awareness is always be in a position of expertise when a client comes in and not accepting that they might have something to teach us, and that we can use that piece of learning to better serve them. And even when we finish serve, maybe we walk away from that relationship having learned something about ourselves. And so go back to the first thing I said, always being this idea where I'm always the person that can help others and never allow myself to work on myself. That can be the biggest pitfall.
Yeah, I think I might have mentioned it earlier anyway. I think Ali's absolutely spot on. Is that recognizing that our athletes, our clients are the experts on themselves, right? We're there to guide the process. But at the same time, Ali was coming from it as uh, a, a white person in the room, as the practitioner in the room, even as the person uh, of intersectional. I mean, we haven't even spoken about that much, right? The intersectional identity that I come with into the room, the experiences of being marginalized in various ways through that identity, being really aware of how I show up so that it, if a white client is sitting in front of me, that I'm not impacting that relationship in a way just because now I'm making assumptions or based on that white privilege, and thinking, well, you've got white privilege, so let me tell you what I've experienced. It's not about me, and really being aware of that identity when I come into the room, and the power that that I have in that sort of relationship, because often your athlete will come into the room and think that you are the expert, but really recognizing that they're the experts of their own sort of identity
Mm.
in that relationship, and I'm here to help them through their process.
I think it's really interesting because as a trainee, you're always told, and we're always taught, and we always practice, um, not falling into that expert trap, making sure that I'm not the expert in the room. The athlete knows the most about themselves and about their sport and about their own mind, but we never really touched upon that from this perspective. We never really touched on this idea of identity or culture or experience.
I was just thinking. I think that based on what this conversation we are having, one of the biggest pitfall that I can think of now is the fear of making a mistake, and the fear to be quote unquote a bad person for having made that mistake. And I think that obviously we want to be mindful on how we interact with others, right? But I also believe that the serenity of fully being and wholly being in that relationship during that moment, and accepting that we have knowledge gaps, and the other person is not there to teach us because that's our own work to do, uh, and at the same time accepted that piece of the work may not have been done yet, and so that you're working. And so sometimes I think that the inability to engage with somebody else's identities, or cultures or race, or sexual orientation or gender identification, oftentimes is dictated by the fear to say or do the wrong thing, which obviously we have to continue to educate ourselves. And I also think that sometimes serenely normalize the interaction can have a much bigger and positive impact that not. And the other part is, um, there are some aspects that we may not just be aware of, and even if we reflect upon it, because things may not come out right. So I have an accent and I cannot take it out. And one thing I've noticed oftentimes that people think that I think with an accent as well, but I just talk with an accent, and so that
That's just
creates
blown my
issue.
mind.
Mine too.
Shams, you
No,
wanted to come in
and I,
there?
I just want to agree and totally wholeheartedly sort of say, saying that your client is the expert doesn't mean that we don't have to do the work. I just want to make that point because I know I've
Mhm.
spoken a lot about, uh, the client, the athlete is the expert on how they identify, and but at the same time, we do need to do the work before we go into that relationship or into that interaction.
So we are here with Shamima Yusuf and Alessandro Quartiroli, and we're talking about all things related to diversity and cultural awareness in sport, which is a really important topic. And we've had some absolutely fantastic insights from our guests so far. So, one of the arguments that crops up quite often is this idea of perceived discrimination. And I've had this before when you get asked, how do you know you've been discriminated against? How do you know it was racism or sexism or homophobia or whatever it might be, whatever form of discrimination? That quizzing of the person, how do you know it was this? And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, this idea of perceived discrimination where people might question whether what you've experienced really is what you've experienced, because they maybe see what's happened in a very different way.
So from my perspective, my job is not to make judgment on the situation, but it is to understand and explore the experience of the individual, the client, the athlete, and to really understand and validate their experience. And second thing that comes to my mind is that from whose perspective is it not discriminatory? That there's that to consider too. But really, my job as the psychologist and the practitioner is to really understand and validate the experience. So that's first and foremost that comes to my mind.
Ale, I know I have some thoughts on this. What do you think?
I agree with Shams. My question would be, regardless what led to that experience, something developed that experience. And so my first thought is trying to understand what the origins of that experience is. Because there is a story of the individual that felt something to be discriminatory, I wonder how it's been felt. That's the key question, right? What led to what?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that as a practitioner, from both perspectives, how the person felt discriminated, a person that may have discriminated, I would stay away from the judgment of value or the value judgment, trying to understand what led the person to feeling that way and how that feeling felt.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the key two pieces.
Yeah, I think I reflect on times when I've had to explain why I feel that something is racist, or I justify why I feel the way that I do about something. Times when I've had to, expose my own lived experiences to people who've perhaps already decided that actually, what you're experiencing isn't racism. They've kind of already made that decision. They don't see the same thing that I see, and that can be exhausting having to do that over and over again. And I think there are times, having had that experience over and over again of having to justify and having to explain with people who are saying, well, there's no discrimination there, like I don't see it. It becomes exhausting. And what happens is that you end up just not bothering. I've learned to pick my battles, which is a horrible thing to have to say, because I should be, we should be fighting this at every stage. We should be sort of highlighting discrimination. But as a person of color, I've learned that actually it's important to pick your battles, and that's how racism and discrimination fuels itself, because we don't say anything, because we stay silent, because we know so many times that other people will be going, well, there's no discrimination there. Yeah, I think you both wanted to come in on that.
Just very quickly, and I'm glad you brought up this example, because I don't know how is the experience, your experience, Peter.
Mm.
Something that I've noticed in moment of fatigue, because as I mentioned earlier, people sometimes assume that I think with an accent. It became very blurred in conversation if certain aspect that I don't perceive fair is because of my accent. And so the question constantly is in my head because of what I experienced. And it sounded that was part of what you were sharing, the idea of there has been so much that the way I feel this, it may be because of what is, or may be because of another, but that's my feeling. And so why we are spending time to discuss about my feeling, and if it's true or not, because it's my feeling.
Really, what I heard from your example, Peter, is that you feel silenced at times. At the end of the day, what it is, it's silencing someone because they don't feel they can speak up about certain experiences, because they're just going to be questioned in a way that sort of says your experience, your feeling isn't real, isn't they're not validating what you've just experienced. I think also what we're in danger of doing a lot of the time is that, well, that's not racism. Well, may not be racism, but actually discrimination isn't just racism, or it isn't just it could be that because of my intersectional identity or your intersectional identity, that you're being marginalized by some power dynamic. It may not necessarily be about your race. It may be about the intersectional identity in the way within the context that you're in. So that's the other important part, the nuances of your identity in the context that you're in.
Yeah.
So I had someone that said to me the other day, well, how do you know that was racism, not sexism? And I said, well, okay, even if it was sexism, it's still being marginalized by some descriptive of my identity. And so that's why for me, as Ali says, it's really about exploring those feelings and those experiences, and that will give you a story, an understanding.
Yeah. And I think that, the danger of not doing that is that it leads to self-gaslighting. Somebody questions whether the discrimination is there or not. You kind of internalize that, and it's like, well, maybe I am imagining it. Maybe it is me. Maybe maybe this kind of discrimination isn't as big a deal as I thought it was, or maybe it's not kind of the case. And again, that's just like you described it, Shams. It's being silenced, isn't it? But it's almost silencing yourself because you know that, well, there's not much point in making a fuss about it. So I think that's a real important point that you both have highlighted there.
And sorry, just a quick add. We also have to not miss the idea that this constant level of microaggression and macroaggression have some serious health consequences, and because it has a real impact on the life of a person as well as on the health of a person. And so I think that for our own comfort, we minimalize a lot of this impact, because that makes the person that may made a mistake feeling bad about themselves.
You know what's so interesting is you may not have seen it, Ali, because you're out in the States, but I wonder, maybe Pete, you might have seen it, the documentary with Anton Ferdinand. And what immediately there was a scene there that actually brought me to tears, because Anton was clearly emotional. The effects of discrimination are not just around one event, and the impact can be long lasting. And each time you are faced with a microaggression, no matter how trivial it might seem to some people, it builds upon each other. It keeps building upon. Every time you meet with one microaggression, it's building upon one another and another and another and another, and that ongoing build up is what really impacts one's mental health. When faced with another one, that could be really the trigger that reminds you of all the trauma that you've experienced throughout a lifetime. And so that was what really came to my mind when I was watching that documentary, is that, with all the time that has passed, he was still hurting. And you could see that his mental health and well-being had been impacted over this period of time, where, even revealing to him that his performance had been impacted, lack of concentration, that the gaffer sort of said to him, I could see that it had impacted your concentration. And he turned around and he sort of said, oh, I thought my performance was okay. But that revelation really hurt him in that moment. So really to be aware of the fact that, this is not just one event. This is often
it's often a lifetime's worth of those sorts of experiences. We have a problem with weirdness. Our research is weird. It's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic in terms of participant samples, in terms of the countries that we conduct research in. And I wonder, as practitioners, researchers, what do you think is the impact of that? And what are some of the steps that we might take to change it?
I was recently reading an article that was making this point. The writing limitation is just not enough. We have to, what we do with those limitations, which I think is the big part at times. In terms of what can we do, goes back to what we discussed a little bit earlier today, being deliberate in trying to overcome these limitations and go and gather participants that are not part of the weird population, right? And sometimes it's very hard, but I also think that there is some little steps can be done just to create awareness. So, for example, something that I deliberately do when I interview people, professionals from around the world, I use indigenous names of the area where they come from when I use the pseudonyms.
Mhm.
And I purposely do that so to give a message, right? That there is not only John Smith and Ellie McGill
Mhm.
names. And so, and do I solve the issue of with the weirdness of sample? No, and sometimes it's very hard to do it. At the same time, create that awareness. I think that really make the extra step. And the other aspect I think is limited. It goes back to the conversation that Shams was having earlier about the theory. Even when the samples are not weird, the theoretical frameworks we start from are weird. So I think that we have two type of work. One is make our sample participation more inclusive, deliberately more inclusive, regardless who we study. And the other end, exploring all these theoretical frameworks and see if there are other theoretical frameworks that come from a not a weird background. So these are two parallel work that we need to do. For what we have right now, again, not dismiss and not assume that it is the research.
From a different perspective, I think it's really important for us that we diversify the intake of students who come from diverse backgrounds. It might also help, we may start to see research coming from different frameworks and lenses. I'm also reminded just recently, actually, I was so delighted to come across research from Zimbabwean perspective, from research out of Zimbabwean universities that is talking about how they have social care and community care in an African contextual framework. So really recognizing that there is research out there in other parts of the world. Are we doing enough to really include some of that within our own frameworks in the Western, in the weird countries, and then ensuring that we've got some funds and we're opening up funding for research in other frameworks and from other cultural perspectives. I think that becomes grants. That's what I mean. Making sure grants are available to those who are from who'd like to pursue research from other cultural perspectives that isn't part of the weird framework, and that we promote that cultural research.
I also think, if I may add, I also think that there is another level of conversation here that we read the research that is published, and what happened with the publication process at times, the parameters with which journals at times evaluate research are parameters of certain westernized, quote unquote, weird built parameters, right? So there's research that comes from different frameworks that are not the mainstream framework. The process of evaluation of this research has to be done with parameters that may be slightly different than the one that we use to evaluate research. So, Pete, you brought up self-determination theory, right? Uh, that's very much used. So, assuming that a person, I use the example of Shams from Zimbabwe, right, a study about motivation. First, the serenity of being able not to use the self-determination theory and be certain that can be published with another approach that is more Zimbabwe centered, right? And then the journal, though, cannot evaluate the Zimbabwe centered approach to motivation from the perspective of mainstream and say, well, self-determination says a different thing. So this is not good research because of that, and therefore avoid the possibility for being published. I think that goes both ways, the production and the evaluation of research.
To bring this back to the theme of the podcast, all right, we're talking about sport and performance and the mental side of sport and performance. Sport's often seen as this great leveler, right? Sport is often held up as this example of a perfect meritocracy where talent and hard work will see you rise to the top. And I think that is a fundamentally flawed vision of what sport actually is. Sports is a part of society like any other part of society, and it's filled with inequality and injustice. And, sport's not exempt from that somehow. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I can give you my thought on that. Actually, I have a slightly different perspective on it. Peter, I think I hear what you're saying, except I'll give you my example of as someone who was raised in Southern Africa during a time not long after I came into the sports scene, in terms of my level really um, becoming more elite at a time that wasn't long after independence in a country that it had been through the apartheid, segregation
Mhm.
type regime. And so sport really means a lot more to me because as it was dominated by the white population. And so for me, it really meant something to be sort of participating in those environments as someone who is now being able to break into it.
Mhm.
Um, and whilst my coach, I remember my Zimbabwean coach, I was playing for Zimbabwe under 18s and under 21 squad, but and I remember my coach at the time not really wanting to make eye to eye contact, not really engaging me in conversation, within group conversation, and really leaving me out in many ways. For me, I would always go onto the pitch and say, "This is where I show you I'm an equal. And this is where I'm going to show you that I deserve to be right here with everyone else on the pitch." And in that way, for me personally, it was a great leveler.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with that. I think that once you get on the pitch, absolutely talent and hard work will see you shine and see you rise to the top. The difficulty is getting on the pitch in the first place.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And if you look at some of the inequality that exists in sport, and again, at the risk of people accusing me of talking about race all the time, I'll talk about race here. We have a situation in the Premier League, for example, where a third of the players are non-white, and you have 1 out of 20 Premier League coaches who is a coach of color. You have 80% of the NBA being black in terms of the playing staff, and you have what is it like about 30% of coaches, I think. Inequality is everywhere in sport, but I totally agree that once you get on the pitch, talent and hard work, absolutely. But it's the inequality that underpins all of that I think is the point that I was making, really. Ali, do you have any thoughts there?
You anticipate what I had to say. I think that the entry point is meaningful. Not the entry point is not the same for everybody, and the accessibility, and also as you just highlighted, there is a clearly different role played by athletes versus coaches or managers or
Mm,
vice presidents, presidents, and owners, and so on. So there is that differentiation. It's not the same. One thing, a couple of things that I was reflecting upon, even those that have made it, on one end, their identity don't stop. Or just look at how often people choose to disclose their identities, whether it's about sexual orientation or gender identification,
mhm,
after their athletic career. That tells us something in the climate that
mm,
within sport we still experience. Um, and even those that quote unquote fit the big group, um, do everybody gets the same support, the same level of um, facilities and access, and so on. And I also think that there is a different piece that plays a potentially big role is the meaning that quote unquote make it in sport has. And for some people, sport can be just a personal achievement. For some people, represent to be able to carry their entire community. and getting out of a situation that they perceive not being the situation they want to be for themselves or their family. And clearly, reaching performance or not reaching performance and success has a very different value. If I am a rich person that doesn't make it playing uh, field hockey, and might not be as relevant as a person that receiving a big contract in field hockey has a way to get out from a segregate neighborhood in the hinterland of a city, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that in itself create a big discrimination in terms of experience and difference.
Yeah, I wasn't addressing the starting point. You're absolutely correct. So my point was that when I'm on the pitch on that court, that's when I can show that this is where I belong. That that being said, um, the access, and even thinking back to the time, when I was a child, growing up, and that still exists today, is that, as you say, we're all starting from different points, different starting points, and for me, I always acknowledge and recognize that I was very fortunate to have come from a socioeconomic status, and I had privilege being at the school that I was at, one of the the top schools in the region, gave me access to facilities that a lot of people, of marginalized backgrounds would not have had. They wouldn't have had that access. And because I was within that school environment, I had the access to the facilities. And I do recognize that's the privilege that I had.
Colleagues, I've been reflecting a little bit about what you've just said on entry points, identity development, some great points made, and even on privilege. And thinking about what I've always believed, that once I'm on that pitch or in that environment, it's leveled. And actually, perhaps that's not quite so true. Because in those environments, on that pitch, on that court, we may still be facing microaggressions and face racism. So when I think about Anton Ferdinand, football player who decades later is still trying to process his journey in life and process the racism that he has faced, and he catches up with coach decades later to talk about an incident with John Terry that happened on the pitch. It comes as a surprise to him to hear from the coach that his performance was never quite the same after that incident. In his mind, he had just sort of picked up and carried on. And yet what this speaks to is that racism is trauma. It shapes our experiences for the rest of our lives. And it takes time to process, just as it's been taking time for Anton to process. So for the coaches, the administrators, the practitioners, anyone listening in to this podcast, it's something that we want to be aware of so that we recognize how we interact with those individuals and are aware that they may still be trying to process some of these experiences and try to understand that they may approach situations in a slightly different way given what they have experienced and faced throughout their lives.
I do have one more question, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. 2020 was a pretty incredible year for a whole number of reasons. But I feel like the summer of 2020 woke a lot of people up to racial discrimination in particular. people who perhaps hadn't seen it before, hadn't heard it before, hadn't understood the depths of it before, or maybe just hadn't quite appreciated it before, maybe. And the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Rashard Brooks in America, it kind of really woke a lot of people up to the idea of or ideas about racial discrimination and like I say, the depths of it. Um, I think a lot of people of color, myself included, were kind of skeptical because we've seen these sorts of awakenings before, right? 2018 when Stephon Clark was shot and killed by police for holding a mobile phone in his grandma's back garden, and Botham Jean was shot by an off-duty police officer for eating ice cream in his own apartment. People were kind of shocked by that. 2016, Philando Castile was shot and killed by police in his car in front of his girlfriend and his 4-year-old daughter. And Alton Sterling was killed by police for selling CDs. 2014, Eric Garner. Before that, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Tanisha Anderson. In the UK, Sheku Boyer, Sean Rigg, Mark Duggan. The list is a really long one, and I've made it a deliberately long list. And I've not even mentioned this constant stream of examples of Black people and people of color being brutalized and harassed and bullied and threatened that crop up on social media pretty much every day. If we assume that being exposed to this daily trauma, and I use that word very deliberately, doesn't have an impact on coaches, athletes, and colleagues of color, we are doing them a massive disservice. But my question is this awakening, this awareness that meant people were suddenly desperate to get a hold of a copy of Rennie Edo-Lodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and people posting black squares on their Instagram. How do we turn that into something more sustainable? How do we make sure that coaches and psychologists and athletes who are suddenly really interested in this stuff in the middle of 2020 continue to do the work into 2021 and beyond?
I think it has to be addressed on many different levels, actually, Pete. I think it has to be, well, we've spoken a little bit about today about practitioners themselves doing the work, self-educating, really exploring their own worldview and how they show up. But I think there's a systemic a systems level. There's got to be some action at a systems level. And so really we need organizations not just to speak about these things or to have their policies written down on pieces of paper, but to really have a strategy that takes them from that paper into action. And so, what are some of the actions that they're taking to implement changes within those organizations? Like, for instance, as you might know, I'm on the BASES Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, and so, for instance, the little things like what grants are we making available to students of color? Or from marginalized backgrounds, how are we supporting their growth in the field? Making travel grants to conferences available, thinking about as supervisors where we have supervision fees, are our fees, is there a guided process, or is there a guide to what that range of fees would be so that we are not really excluding those who may be of low socioeconomic status in that process of getting supervision. Thinking about accreditation processes and becoming a BASES scientist in psychology. Well, does the training program include training in cultural perspectives? So that those practitioners are being trained from day one in thinking about some of these things. So it's really about operationalizing a strategy and not just having a policy, and then holding each other to account.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say, people on Twitter and social media, amongst our own colleagues, are very defensive when you bring up some of the discussion and you challenge one another. But this is what we have to do. We have to hold each other to account and deliver on what we're saying that we are interested in, and we do want to see change. Then we've got to follow through on that.
I think that's an absolutely wonderful answer, Shams, and it brings us right back to what we talked about at the very start about this idea of letting go of some of the defensiveness that crops up when we talk about these things, when we mention words like diversity and inclusion and equality and privilege. And the first step, I think, is to, like I say, just let go of that defensiveness that surrounds that. And that comes from, constantly being challenged, and we have a responsibility to do that. And there's a level of discomfort. There's going to be a level of discomfort around this. And just in the same way that we would want our athletes to be accepting of that discomfort, we have to do that ourselves as practitioners, as coaches, as trainee psychologists. We have to embrace that discomfort if we're going to move forward. So I think that answer was absolutely wonderful and really captured a lot of the conversations that you and I have, outside of this as well.
I think with any of this, I think we need to recognize that it is complex. There are no instant solutions to some of the things, some of the experiences, and that we cannot see things through one lens. We need to really understand the context, the nuance, the intersectional representation, in really trying to understand the experience and the difficulty that someone is going through. And so that's my feeling about this. And someone sort of said to me a couple of months ago, rang me up and sort of said, this was their experience, and they're really pissed off, and they're feeling really angry, and they're not, now they're questioning themselves, and they're not sure, and was it racism or not racism? I don't want to blow it out of control, and I don't want to make a big deal of it, but I'm feeling guilty, but I don't know, I'm feeling uncomfortable. And a simple answer to that is, if it feels icky, if it feels that something's not quite right, it probably isn't. It probably isn't.
It's been an absolutely brilliant discussion, and thank you so much, Shamima Yusuf, Shams, for joining us on the 80% Mental podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on.
It's been a privilege for me to be on here, and I hope it helps a lot of people out there, and really thanks for having myself, and also a privilege to join Ali on here too.
No, you're more than welcome. And your consultancy, Empower to Perform, we will put a link to that in the description for the episode. So if you want to get in touch with Shams, you can do that via there. We'll put all your details in the episode description. Thank you very much to Ale Quartiroli for coming on our podcast, 80% Mental. Ale, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you.
Thank you for having me, for the opportunity, the privilege to be here with you all, and for thinking about this topic, which is very important in sport and in life. So thank you.
Well, honestly, what an episode that was. That was absolutely fantastic. And I'm so grateful to our guests, Ale Quartiroli and Shamima Yusuf, for joining us today and sharing their expertise and their insights and their thoughts on this subject. We've talked about so many different things in this episode on diversity and cultural awareness. I think it might actually be one of the most important episodes that we've done on this podcast so far. And I think if I could highlight one thing in particular that came from this conversation that I think is the most important thing for our listeners to take on board, is the idea that we don't need to be defensive when it comes to talking about diversity and inclusion and equality and privilege. Sometimes these conversations are going to be uncomfortable. That's just the way it is. And as Ale mentioned, I think that stems from a desire to not want to say the wrong thing or not want to look like we're a bad person in some way. But it's not about that. It's about noticing the differences in all of us and embracing those differences. And that's something that we should all be engaging in, whether we are athletes or coaches or sports psychologists or anybody working in sport or just members of the public. Diversity isn't something to be afraid of. Yes, it can be a challenge, but I think it's a challenge that we should be facing head on. I really, really hope that you have taken something from this episode today. Don't forget that you can listen to all of our other episodes on our website, www.80percentmental.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what you've heard today. We'd really, really love to hear what you think about some of the things that we've talked about. So leave a comment at our website, or you can tweet us at EPM Podcast. If you have enjoyed it, please do spread the word, share on your social media. It's the easiest way for people to find us. So as I say, I hope you've enjoyed today, and I will see you next time. Well, I won't see you because it's a podcast.